This system on 1/8 of an acre is capable of feeding a massive family year-round, turning 500 square meters of land into an autonomous source of life. We call it the food reactor. Thanks to this system, you don't just cover basic food needs. You create the foundation for a high-margin business, as it can become your liquid asset in an era of instability. To back this up, online I came across documentary proof of this technology. A real family of 6 is already living by this system, turning their tiny backyard into an endless warehouse of products. I deciphered their methods and studied their yields, from 120 pounds of carrots from a single narrow strip to hundreds of kilograms of protein that stores for years without electricity. In this video, I will tell you everything in the most compressed format and reveal the most absurd thing about this family in their basement, without which your autonomy will turn into a pile of rot in just 1 week. Watch until the end, otherwise your reactor simply won't start. Every reactor requires stable fuel. In our system, this is the Caloric Density Module, but let's make it simpler. To feed a family of 6, you don't need hectares of grain. You need crops that literally accumulate solar energy directly in the soil. This is the foundation. On one narrow strip of land inside the reactor, we get about 55 kilograms of carrots and over 90 kilograms of potatoes, and this is enough to cover carbohydrates for the entire year. Sounds powerful, but this is where most people break. 90% of people, both beginners and even experts, make the same mistake. They think the work ends when you pull the vegetable out of the ground. In reality, everything is just beginning, and it's at this exact moment that it's decided: will you eat this harvest in winter or throw it away as rot in a couple of weeks? Because industrial habits teach us one thing: washing vegetables before storage. I used to do that too, and every time I got the same result. It looks clean, but it doesn't last long. In the food reactor, this is considered a fatal mistake. We use the dirty shield technology. And yes, it sounds strange, the carrots are not washed at all. You pull them from the ground and store them exactly like that, because this layer of earth is not dirt. It's natural protection, a living barrier of microorganisms that holds back rot. Next, it's even simpler. You take ordinary plastic bags, tape up the holes, and that's it. Inside, its own microclimate forms. The vegetable falls asleep, so to speak. It doesn't lose moisture, doesn't spoil, and doesn't turn into rubber. While store-bought carrots become limp after 2 weeks, yours can lie for months, up to 10 months, and stay crunchy. Essentially, you are just slowing down time, and you're doing it in the cheapest way possible. Now, about the money. In conventional agriculture, up to 30% of the harvest is lost during storage and transport. This is the norm. In the food reactor system, you aim for 0 losses. Every kilogram is either food for the family or a commodity, and in winter this commodity becomes especially valuable because live vegetables are a deficit. Therefore, here you are not just storing food. You are creating an energy reserve and essentially your personal bank, which doesn't devalue from inflation. Traditional agriculture took a wrong turn at some point when it started planting everything in long rows. It's convenient for machinery, for tractors, and for scale, but if you think about it, it has almost nothing to do with actual plant biology. In the food reactor, we return to a simpler and, strangely enough, more logical scheme, what I call Aztec geometry, which means planting in dense squares. Take corn, for example. If you plant it in rows, like almost everyone does, the result is often empty or underdeveloped ears, and many don't even understand why. The reason is trivial. Corn is wind-pollinated, and in long rows, the pollen simply blows away and gets lost. I came across this myself once and couldn't understand for a long time why half the harvest was empty. When you gather it into a dense square, everything changes. An enclosed space is created inside, and the pollen doesn't fly away but circulates between the plants. As a result, almost every kernel fills up. Plus, the stalks themselves start to support each other, making such a planting much harder for the wind to knock down. Essentially, you aren't just growing a crop, you're creating a stable system that squeezes the maximum out of every meter. But carbohydrates are only half the task. To actually feed a family of 6, you also need a stable source of protein. And this is where the bean concentration module kicks in within the reactor. The simplest and most underrated option is ordinary dry beans. They store for years, require no refrigerators or canning, and yet remain a complete source of protein. The problem lies elsewhere, in processing. If you do everything by hand, it turns into endless, tedious work that eats up a ton of time. At some point, it becomes clear that the system simply doesn't scale that way. That's why we use what sounds impressive as pulse cleaning, but is actually a very simple solution. The entire harvest is put into pillowcases and literally beaten against a hard surface. Due to inertia, the grains themselves separate from the pods in a matter of minutes. The first time, it looks a bit wild, but when you see the result, the questions disappear. And this is where the key difference appears. Where a typical farmer spends hours or hires people, you finish the same task alone and many times faster. In the end, you get a clean product with practically zero processing costs. In a system where 1/8 of an acre must feed 6 people, such things decide everything. Because the value here is not just the harvest, but your time. If you start saving hours at every stage, the entire system turns from just a garden into a truly manageable mechanism that works for you, rather than the other way around. Any system that produces food eventually runs into the problem of storage. And this is where most people make a mistake. They try to solve everything with a regular refrigerator. At first glance, it seems logical. But if you have a family of 6, it very quickly becomes clear. The refrigerator is a bottleneck. It's small, constantly packed, and consumes electricity. At some point, you start working for it, rather than it working for you. In the food reactor, we go the other way and use a thermal insulation module, essentially turning a regular basement into a natural refrigerator that works thanks to the earth itself. There's no magic here, just pure physics. At a depth of about 1.5 meters, the temperature stabilizes around 8 to 10 degrees Celsius and barely changes in summer or winter. This means you already have a ready-made cooling system under your feet. The only question is how to use it correctly. And for this, you don't need to dig any tunnels or call in heavy machinery. Everything is done inside a regular basement. A corner is walled off, preferably where the walls are in contact with the ground, and the rest is simply well insulated. The result is an isolated space where the temperature stays stable and the spoilage process slows down significantly. It feels like you've put time on pause. Vegetables don't rot in weeks as they do in a warm room. They sit quietly for months. But here is the point where a huge number of people fail. Moreover, the mistake is so simple that people don't even believe it until they encounter it themselves. You cannot store onions and potatoes together at all. This isn't a case of it's better to separate them. It's a strict you must not. Onions release ethylene, a gas that triggers the ripening process. And when it reaches the potatoes, they begin to sprout. One crate of onions can ruin the entire supply in a few weeks. I've seen people lose almost their entire harvest just because of this. That's why in a proper system, these things are always separated. Next, there's another point that almost no one thinks about. A basement isn't just a warehouse. Vegetables continue to breathe. They take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. If the space is airtight, without proper ventilation, it becomes a problem. First, the harvest begins to spoil, and then it's simply unsafe for the person who enters. Therefore, the system must have simple ventilation. Without it, the entire reactor might simply not work as it should. And one more thing that beginners often ignore: you can't just dig up potatoes and immediately put them in the basement. This is a nearly guaranteed way to get rot. Any root crop needs time to seal, about 2 weeks in the shade, in the air. During this time, the skin thickens, minor damage heals, and it becomes much more resistant to storage. Only after that does it make sense to move it into the cold. This entire system eventually provides a simple but powerful thing. You stop being dependent on electricity and get stable storage almost for free. While someone else is paying for refrigerators and losing part of their harvest, you can calmly keep your supplies and wait for the right moment. Essentially, it's not just a basement, it's your warehouse, where products don't devalue over time, but instead become more valuable, especially in winter. And if you want to enhance the system, you can go further and use something like a CoolBot. But for basic autonomy, that's already excessive. In most cases, it's enough to simply use what you already have under your feet correctly. When we talk about the food reactor on 1/8 of an acre, it quickly becomes clear. The main shortage is not water or even fertilizer, but space. This is where classical gardening fails, because it allows plants to simply sprawl across the ground, taking up tons of space while giving mediocre results. In the reactor, we go into another dimension. We literally lift everything up. The vertical system makes it possible to turn 15 tomato plants into a full source of sauces, ketchups, and preserves for a whole year for a family of 6. It sounds like an exaggeration, but in practice it works exactly like that if everything is set up correctly. The problem is that tomatoes are one of the most vulnerable crops, and the main enemy here is blight. If you've dealt with it, you know. Yesterday everything was green and healthy, and a couple of days later the bushes are simply dead. Most people start fighting it after the fact, soaking the plants in chemicals when there is essentially nothing left to save. In the food reactor, we act proactively. One of the key techniques is the so-called bare stem method. From the bottom, approximately 30 to 40 centimeters, all foliage is removed from the tomato. At first it looks harsh, even as if you are harming the plant, but this is exactly what breaks contact with the soil, because the whole problem starts from below. Fungal spores live in the upper layer of the earth and rise up with moisture. Removing this bridge significantly reduces the risk. Next comes another simple but powerful layer of protection. The soil under the plants should not be bare. We cover it with a layer of dry leaves. When it rains, drops don't hit the ground and splash infected particles onto the leaves. Essentially, you extinguish the very mechanism of disease spread. This is one of those things that seems like a small detail, but it saves a huge amount of time and nerves during the season. And there is an even higher level, prevention. We don't use heavy chemicals because they hit not only the fungus, but the entire system as a whole. Instead, once a week, there is a simple treatment: liquid seaweed plus a drop of organic soap. It sounds almost unserious, but it works. Seaweed strengthens the plant's immunity, and the soap helps the solution stick to the leaves and creates an environment in which it's harder for the fungus to take hold. This is not a cure, it is protection before the problem ever appears. And here, another principle of the reactor becomes clear. We don't chase the number of plants. 15 normally formed, lifted up, and properly maintained plants give more results than dozens or hundreds growing haphazardly. When tomatoes are fixed on a mesh, well ventilated, and don't touch the ground, they bear fruit longer and more stably. In the end, you harvest when most people are already finished, and then the economics kick in. You don't just sell fresh tomatoes that spoil quickly. You turn them into a value-added product, sauces, ketchups, preserves. And that is exactly what people are willing to pay more for. In the end, this entire bioshield is not just a fight against diseases, but a system that turns a limited plot into a stable and predictable source of product and income. The biggest problem with any food reactor isn't drought, pests, or even the size of the plot. The most dangerous enemy is you, specifically how you spend your time. Conventional gardening subtly turns a person into service staff. Today you go to pick some raspberries. Tomorrow you weed a bed. The day after you're standing there trying to jar a few bottles of sauce. It seems simple, but in total it eats up hours every day and eventually just burns you out. As a result, the system that was supposed to provide autonomy starts crushing you instead. That's why in the food reactor, we initially build everything around a different logic, batch loading. It sounds complicated, but essentially it's about not doing the same thing bit by bit every day. This gradual harvesting is actually a trap. It keeps you in constant tension and prevents you from focusing on anything else. If you are truly feeding a family of 6, your task is not to play in the garden for pleasure, but to build a system that works efficiently. This is where the concept of lazy gardening comes from. And no, it's not about being lazy. It's about not making unnecessary movements. Instead of stretching the harvest over the whole summer, we gather it in powerful, clear cycles. Take corn, for example. Most people plant it in stages, then spend the whole summer boiling a few ears at a time, constantly returning to the same task. In the reactor, one big planting is done, everything ripens at once, and you simply set aside 2 days a year to process the entire volume at once. Within those 48 hours, the corn issue is closed until next season. It's the same with raspberries. No one runs around with a mug every day. The harvest is gathered once, processed, and that's it. You don't return to it for almost a year. At that moment, a huge amount of time is freed up. Time that used to simply dissolve into trivialities. Then comes another important principle: synchronization. The most common mistake is trying to do everything simultaneously. The garden, work, and education. In reality, this almost always ends with nothing being done properly. In the reactor, everything is strictly divided by seasons. There is a period when the system requires maximum attention, and during this time, everything else is simply put on pause. And then, once the harvest is gathered and put away, you have a long period of calm. The most interesting part is winter. Many think summer is easier because the food is right on the garden bed. In practice, it's the opposite. In the summer, you're constantly running, picking, cleaning, and cooking. In winter, the system starts working for real. Once a week, you go down to the basement, take the products you need, quickly prepare everything, and form meal kits for several days ahead. This takes less than an hour. After that, you just cook without thinking every time about what to do. Life becomes predictable and calm. From a money perspective, there's a serious advantage here. When you stop wasting time, your labor cost drops sharply. Where someone else fusses for 10 hours, you close the same task in an hour or even faster. This gives you a choice: either earn more or simply work less. Ultimately, the food reactor is no longer about garden beds. It's about managing your time. You stop being a person who is constantly doing things with your hands and become the one who sets up the system. If everything is assembled correctly, it stops requiring your constant presence and starts working in the background. And that is the main result. Not just food, but the free time that you get back. The final element of the food reactor isn't about the garden beds at all. It's about how you manage what you've already grown. Most people use their basement as a junk room for miscellaneous clutter. In our system, it is essentially the control center, your personal supermarket. At some point, you begin to understand a simple truth. When you have a food supply, you exit the game where prices are constantly rising and shelves sometimes go empty. You stop depending on that cycle. For a family of 6, this is the difference between constant tension and the feeling that you have everything under control. The foundation here is quite simple. Airtight storage of dry goods. There are things you won't grow in sufficient volume on a small plot. Grain, rice, sugar, salt. It's easier to buy them once, in bulk, and forget about it. Standard food-grade buckets solve almost everything. Seal it, put it in the basement, and you have a supply that sits quietly for years. Plus, the basement itself, with its concrete walls and floor, already provides protection against rodents and excess moisture. In the end, you simply eliminate the loss factor, which many, for some reason, consider the norm. But the real power of the system appears when you combine this with what you grow yourself. Dry goods are the base, and you cover everything else with your own preserves, sauces, marinades, vegetables. At some point, you develop a complete nutritional system that is practically independent of the outside world. This is how people used to live. They bought the basics and grew the rest themselves or traded with neighbors. Today it sounds unusual, but essentially it's just a more efficient model, and the feeling here is completely different. While someone else is worrying about prices or shortages, you simply go down to the basement and take what you need, because you've already paid for it with your time during the season. Then the business side kicks in. As soon as you cover the family's needs, any surplus becomes a product. And it's important to note that you aren't just selling vegetables, you are selling something clear, quality and safety. People are willing to pay for that, especially when they see how it was grown. And it scales quite simply. The first plot feeds you, the next one starts making money. Over time, a circle of people forms around you who buy your products constantly without any complex advertising. This is no longer a one-time sale, but a stable stream. Ultimately, this entire system provides not just food, but financial stability. You eliminate a significant portion of your expenses and simultaneously gain a source of income. Most importantly, you control the basic thing without which everything else makes no sense. In the end, the food reactor is not about gardening as a hobby. It's about control over your life at the most fundamental level. It all starts with simple things: a crate of carrots, a bucket of beans, a few shelves of preserves. But it's from these things that the feeling of stability is built. The question is no longer whether it will work, but whether you will start doing it. Because the whole system only works in one case: when you move from being an observer to the person who actually implements it.